How did mobile processors bring Apple and Samsung together?
And why did they divorce?
More importantly, who gets custody of the kids?
Will Judge Ko make one side pay alimony? Watch the next 3 episodes of Chip Wars to find out more about how this relationship, forged in silicone, went sour. Samsung has been producing system-on-chips for over 10 years, powering up smart devices for OEMs like HP and Palm, but the market was slow and small. But today, Apple and Samsung are battling it out over a huge mobile market. But there was a time, long, long ago, when these competitors were smaller, weaker, and willing to date each other over this one piece of hardware. It was Apple's iPhone that put Samsung-designed chips on the smartphone map. These early iPhones and the corresponding iPod Touches were built on Samsung's S5L8900 chipset that had an ARM11 core clocked at 412 MHz together with the integrated GPU, the PowerVR MBX Lite at 103 MHz, which, by the way, helped put Imagine Technologies, another mobile tech company, on the processing map.
But we'll save that for episode 7.
This relationship, where Apple handled software design and distribution while Samsung fabricated the chips, was so successful that Apple bought the next Samsung system-on-a-chip, the S5 PC100, underclocked at 600 MHz with the die shrink from 90 to 65 nanometers for the iPhone 3GS and iPod Touch 3G. They ran on the Cortex-A8 core with double the RAM, while the graphics jumped up to 150 MHz with the PowerVR SGX 535 on board.
But Samsung must have been a bit jealous.
It wasn't going to let Apple take all the profit, so they started to flood the market with tons of competing Samsung Android smartphones across all price points. Samsung launched its first major Galaxy, the i7500, in June 2009, but at this point, Samsung had to buy chips from Qualcomm.
See the Snapdragon video links below.
Because they needed the cellular basebands built in. Then, 4 months later, Motorola releases the Droid on the superior OMAP 3 chipset.
Might as well check out the OMAP video too.
And sold over 1 million units in 2.5 months. Samsung had to regroup and come back with something big. During the summer of 2009, Samsung and a small, privately owned company from Texas called Intrinsity announced a breakthrough in mobile processing architecture. They broke the 1 GHz barrier in a single-core design called Hummingbird. Together, Samsung and Intrinsity figured out how to boost performance of a single-core Cortex-A8, but the lines were drawn, and it was on like Donkey Kong. Despite the global financial crisis, demand for smartphones was insatiable, and these two tech companies were at the heart of it. With growing piles of cash on Apple's balance sheet, Tim Cook started making big moves to secure supplies for future iDevices. Just after the first iPad release, speculation heated up over the similarities between the Hummingbird chipset and the first Apple-branded chip, the A4. Then, Apple made it official that it had actually acquired Intrinsity, Samsung's former partner.
Sorry, Samsung.
Still, Samsung continues to manufacture Apple's newly branded A-series processors, only today it almost has no control over Apple chip architecture. But we'll get more into this in another episode. In June 2010, Samsung fired back with the Galaxy S and all its variants. For the first time, Samsung could publicly show off the Hummingbird. It dropped the die to 45 nanometers to break into gigahertz speeds, used the PowerVR SGX 540 graphics at 200 MHz, and supported faster 32-bit dual-channel 200 MHz DDR memory, half a gig in the Galaxy S. Later on, maybe a little bit bitter over Apple's acquisition of Intrinsity, Samsung got rid of the Hummingbird name to call it the Exynos 3 single. Now Samsung finally had a successful phone all to itself. Time magazine ranked the Galaxy S the #2 device of 2010, after the iPad, and it inched past Motorola to become the #1 US mobile handset company with all these devices using the Exynos 3 single, while total Android handset sales passed the iPhone for the first time. Google was impressed because 6 months later, instead of HTC, Samsung was chosen to make the Google Galaxy Nexus S, giving the Exynos 3 single even more market share as the flagship Android gingerbread chipset. In 2011, Samsung introduced the Exynos 4 Dual, codenamed Orion, using an updated dual-core ARM Cortex-A9 with Neon support. For some devices, Samsung replaced the PowerVR GPU with the Mali 400 quad-core, but this Exynos didn't support every cellular network, so Samsung had to fragment its products. For example, the S2 sold in Asia and Europe have the OMAP 4 chipset with the PowerVR SGX 540 GPU. In the US, the T-Mobile S2 and AT&T Skyrocket used the Qualcomm Snapdragon S3 chipsets, while only Sprint's Epic 4G Touch got the Exynos. One problem with so many different versions of the Galaxy S2 on the market was that next to Apple's product line, it really looked messy and confusing. So Apple continued to dominate the smartphone industry with the iPhone 4S, 4, and 3GS taking the top top 3 spots, while the Galaxy S2 and Evo 3D were in 4th and 5th place. But because Samsung had so many devices, it is the largest smartphone maker in the world so far. Then, the Galaxy S3 was born. This time, Samsung was ready with only 2 major versions. The North American version uses the Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 Plus to support LTE, while the international version uses the star of the show, the Exynos 4 Quad with the Mali 400 quad-core GPU. According to Samsung, this chipset doubles the performance of the Exynos 4 Dual, with 32-bit dual-channel RAM at 400 MHz, using 20% less power because of the die shrink to 32 nanometers. The South Korean model is the ultimate Galaxy S3, with the Exynos 4 Quad on LTE and 2 gigs of RAM. In 2013, the Exynos 5 should be 20% faster with 2 GHz ARM Cortex-A15 cores, perhaps an updated ARM Mali T604 quad-core, and up to 533 MHz memory, pushing 12.8 gigabits per second for high-resolution displays. But we'll have to wait and see if they get implemented in any new devices. In the last episode of Chip Wars 2012, we'll have a comparison of all the flagship mobile chipsets on the market today, so stay tuned. So in the end, even though Apple and Samsung are fighting each other with patents and injunctions in courtrooms around the world, they've really learned a lot from each other from their chip-based relationship. Apple learned from the Samsung and Intrinsity partnership that it isn't good enough for a big tech company to innovate on industrial design and software. Good design really begins at the core, literally. And Samsung learned from Apple that if it is going to compete in consumer electronics, the product line needs to be unified, and design is critical. Just look at the Galaxy S3 for proof. Thanks for liking, subscribing, and watching Chip Wars.